What if I told you that the first global economy, the first system that connected continents, powered empires, parked corporate warfare, and created the earliest multinational companies, was not built on oil, gold, silver, or land, but on something so small you could hold a fortune in the palm of your hand? What if the entire structure of modern capitalism, from stock exchanges to global supply chains, started with tiny pieces of dried plants, peppercorns, cinnamon bark, cloves, nutmeg, ginger? Today they sit forgotten in kitchen drawers, but for thousands of years, they were the world's most precious substances. They changed nations, drove exploration, forged alliances, broke civilizations, and shaped the world we live in. The real question is, how did spices, something so common today, once hold the power to topple economies and launch empires? And what lessons does their rise and fall reveal about our world right now? To answer this, we have to travel back thousands of years to a world where food spoiled in days, medicine barely worked, and real flavor was a luxury. Life tasted bland, poor, and often rotten. In that world, discovering a plant that could preserve meat, treat illness, and transform a meal was like discovering magic. Pepper brought heat, cinnamon brought sweetness, cloves could numb pain, nutmeg could energize the body, and all of them could make spoiled food edible long before refrigeration existed. These weren't just flavors, they were survival tools, medicines, religious ingredients, and status symbols. Ancient texts describe spices as gifts fit for kings and gods. People burned them in temples to communicate with deities. Spices became proof of wealth in societies where survival itself was fragile. Because of this, demand for them exploded long before global trade existed. By around 2000 BC, Arab and Indian Ocean traders created the first long-distance supply routes connecting Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and Egypt. But here's where it gets interesting. Almost no one knew where spices were grown. Traders deliberately hid the truth to protect their monopoly. They spread elaborate myths. Cinnamon grew in nests guarded by giant mythical birds. Pepper plants grew in valleys filled with poisonous snakes. Cloves came from islands at the edge of the world. These myths weren't primitive superstitions. They were early corporate strategy. If nobody knew where the spices came from, nobody could compete. And because of this secrecy, the world's first real international economy began forming without anyone fully understanding it. This network eventually reached Rome, and that became the turning point. By the 1st century, Rome's elite classes were obsessed with spices, especially black pepper. They used it in cooking, medicine, cosmetics, and even in religious rituals. Spices became so fashionable that Roman writers complained gold was flowing eastward to pay for luxuries imported from India. Economists today would say Rome developed a massive trade deficit. The empire became dependent on faraway producers it couldn't control. Prices soared, demand skyrocketed, and the spice economy became a vital part of Roman wealth. And when Rome collapsed centuries later, Europe's access to spices shrank dramatically. That scarcity didn't reduce demand, it intensified it. In medieval Europe, spices became symbols of power. To serve spiced dishes meant wealth. To wear clothes infused with cinnamon-scented oils meant nobility. Spices were rare, expensive, and difficult to obtain because Arab and Indian traders still controlled the source regions and the routes that supplied them. Venice, sitting at the edge of the Mediterranean, became the funnel through which spices flowed into Europe. Venetian merchants bought pepper and cinnamon from Arab traders at Egyptian ports and resold them across Europe at enormous markups. Each middleman layer made spices pricier, and Venetians grew fantastically rich. They built palaces, funded armies, and transformed their tiny city into a naval empire, all because they controlled Europe's only reliable access to spices. But this monopoly angered other European powers. By the 1400s, Venice had become so wealthy from spices that other nations realized something crucial. Whoever controlled the spice market controlled global wealth. It wasn't land, religion, or armies that decided economic dominance, it was trade. The monarchs of Europe understood that spices weren't luxuries, they were the heart of a vast, lucrative economic system, and that single realization launched the age of exploration. Portugal acted first. Lacking natural resources, it needed trade to survive. Prince Henry the Navigator funded expeditions along the African coast for decades, searching for a sea route to India that would bypass Arab and Venetian middlemen. After countless failures, storms, shipwrecks, and years of trying, Vasco da Gama finally reached India in 1498. He returned with a cargo of spices worth 60 times the cost of the voyage. That profit margin was unheard of. It changed the game instantly. Portugal now had its own direct access to the spice markets and would no longer be dependent on anyone else. Soon, Portuguese ships armed with cannons sailed into the Indian Ocean, forcing local rulers into trade agreements and seizing ports. Lisbon became the new hub of Europe's spice trade, and money poured into Portugal. But the spice market had a problem. There wasn't enough supply to satisfy all of Europe, let alone multiple competing powers. So Spain joined the race. But instead of sailing around Africa, Spain tried a different strategy. Send a ship westward, Christopher Columbus didn't set out to discover the Americas. He was trying to reach Asia and bring home spices. He wildly underestimated the size of the earth, hit the Caribbean, and thought it was Asia. But Spain kept sending expeditions west in hopes of finding cloves and cinnamon, unaware they had stumbled upon new continents entirely. As more ships reached Asia, something dramatic happened. For the first time in history, Europe could buy spices directly at source. Instead of passing through 5 or 6 layers of merchants, the cargo went straight from India or Indonesia to European ports. The effect was immediate and severe. Prices collapsed. Pepper, once more expensive than gold, fell by nearly 80% in a few decades. Consumers celebrated, but investors panicked. The spice economy suddenly had what every commodity market fears most: oversupply. To stabilize profits, European nations formed massive private trading companies. These weren't companies the way we understand them today. They were state-backed corporations with extraordinary powers. They could sign treaties, raise armies, mint coins, imprison rivals, wage war, and colonize territory. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, became the most powerful of all. At its peak, adjusted for inflation, it was worth more than Apple, Saudi Aramco, and Amazon combined. The VOC was the world's first true mega corporation. The corporations that once dominated spices pivoted to new products: sugar, coffee, tea, tobacco, cotton. Each of these would form its own global boom. Each would build on the supply chains originally created for spices, and each would produce new cycles of exploitation, plantation, labor, monopoly control, and global competition. Spices had built the framework of global capitalism, and other commodities expanded it, but the influence of spices didn't vanish. In fact, their impact is still visible in nearly every part of the modern economic system. The spice trade created the world's first stock markets. It established early forms of corporate governance. It pioneered oceanic insurance. It normalized risky overseas investment schemes. It helped create the legal structures for international trade, colonial rule, and resource extraction. The business models used by modern corporations, from Amazon's logistics to OPEC's resource control, trace their roots to these early spice companies. The deeper lesson here is that value isn't inherent. Peppercorns and cinnamon sticks don't contain magical economic power. Their value was created by scarcity, secrecy, distance, and demand. Replace spices with modern commodities, oil, rare earth metals, lithium, semiconductors, and the pattern is identical. The same dynamics that drove ancient spice markets drive global economies today. OPEC's control of oil supply mirrors Venice and the VOC controlling spices. Today's tech companies, with private global infrastructures and political influence, resemble the East India companies and global supply chains that link dozens of nations through a single product, trace back to the same Indian Ocean routes used for cinnamon and cloves. Here's a startling fact. Around 90% of global trade still moves through the same choke points: the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Persian Gulf that once carried spices. The routes haven't changed, only the cargo has. History repeats in cycles. The spice era followed a predictable pattern. A new commodity appears rare and mysterious. Demand grows, a monopoly forms. Violence increases. Then comes expansion, oversupply, collapse, and a shift to the next commodity. This happened with silver, sugar, cotton, rubber, oil, and now lithium and data. Understanding the rise and fall of the spice economy is understanding capitalism itself. 3 major lessons emerge. First, scarcity is often engineered. Traders exaggerated the rarity of spices, just as companies today manipulate supply to keep profits high. Second, Corporations behave like empires when left unchecked. The VOC and the British East India Company show how private companies can wield more power than nations. Third, globalization isn't modern, it's ancient. Our interconnected world began not with the internet, but with pepper and nutmeg. The spice economy collapsed because too many players chased too little profit. Oversupply destroyed prices. Corporations became too powerful. Governments lost control. Consumers lost fascination. Sound familiar? It should. The same pattern affects today's financial markets, energy systems, tech sectors, and global supply chains. The real question isn't whether the cycle will repeat, it already is. The real question is, which commodity will rise next, and which empire will fall with it? If this breakdown gave you a new perspective on global history and how our world really works, then stick with this channel. Like the video, share it, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden structures behind the global economy. Because the truth is simple but shocking.